Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and today's guest has written a poignant, insightful, and sometimes heart-wrenching memoir chronicling her journey in the 60s and 70s, studying and training to be a doctor, and coming out as a lesbian at a time when society disapproved of both for a woman. Her book is entitled Making the Rounds: Defying Norms in Love and Medicine, and it's a frank and very personal coming-of-age story of her battle against rampant sexism in a male-dominated profession, while at the same time striving to find an enduring, loving relationship during the freewheeling sexual revolution and feminism of the 1970s. Our guest graduated in 1975 from the University of Utah Medical School. She got the highest score in her class in the medical licensing exam. She was the only female intern at the Boston University Hospital. She then completed 2 residencies and earned 2 master's degrees in Public Health and Physiology from the Harvard School of Public Health. In fact, she was the first resident in occupational and environmental medicine at Harvard. She then completed her residency in internal medicine and went on to have a 40-year career as a specialist in Seattle, Washington, and ran her own medical consulting company. After retiring, she decided to write her memoir, which has just been released. I'm delighted to welcome Patricia Grayhall to our show. Patricia, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Harvey. It's a pleasure.
Patricia, I want you to know that your story resonated with me so deeply because we're from the same generation, and I went through a lot of the same struggles as a gay man in the legal profession as you went through in the medical field. Why did you decide to write the book?
Well, I decided to write the book, first of all, just for myself. And then after I did that and started to enjoy the craft of writing, I decided this is history. This has relevance to our current times. And I thought it was important for me to let people know what it was like before Title IX, before Roe, before same-sex marriage was legalized, and actually before even lesbians and gays and queer people were given the similar rights and freedoms as the rest of society. And also, I wanted to inspire people who might be queer, people of color, immigrants, other marginalized people, to inspire them to follow their dreams, even if they're swimming uphill against society and current culture.
Now, although this is a very personal and intimate memoir, you chose not to use your real name. Why not?
Well, when I started writing and I contacted old lovers, I realized that I needed not only to protect my privacy, but also the privacy of some of my characters. One important character has been married to a man for 27 years and has kept our relationship a secret. Another resisted all along that she had any attraction to women of a romantic or sexual nature, and would not want to recognize it now. And yet another was, that the relationship was so difficult, and I had to describe it honestly, but I didn't want to out her as well. So it was really to protect a lot of my characters as well as myself. And of course, patients.
Now, you trained to be a doctor in the early 70s before the law was changed to prohibit discrimination in education based on sex. You were one of only 5 women in your class of 100 students at medical school, and you were the only female intern at Boston University Hospital. You had no female role models or mentors, and on top of all that, you were in constant fear that people might find out that you were a lesbian, which could have ruined your career. That's a lot of stress. What made you want to become a doctor?
Well, it was even more stressful because I went to medical school in Salt Lake City, one of the most conservative states in the country. But what inspired me to be a doctor, it was a combination of things, one of which was the fact that my grandfather was a doctor and I idolized him. And, I he was kind and caring, and his patients loved him. And so I thought how wonderful it would be to help people and interact with people in a caring and loving way, the way he did. And then the other one was I actually met a doctor when I was coming out in San Francisco, a woman, a lesbian. And I thought, well, if she can do it, why not?
Exactly. When you and I were growing up in the 60s, homosexuality was considered both a mental illness and a crime. And the commonly held belief about gay people was that we were all unhappy and depressed and were doomed to have unsuccessful relationships. It was very hard to develop self-esteem in that environment, and you didn't have an easy time with your parents. So where did your self-confidence and ambition and resilience come from?
I wish I knew. I guess I always had to resist something, and whether it was my mother's overbearing nature or what society said. I mean, when I read in the library, just as you said, that homosexuals were doomed to have unhappy lives, and all the movies that I saw that featured lesbians, like The Fox or The Conformist, or, they all had tragic, unhappy endings for the lesbians. And yet, I just somehow, I don't really know why, but I just didn't buy it. I just thought, well, I'm just going to do it anyway, whether it was coming out or being a doctor. And I can't really tell you exactly where I got that strength or that perseverance, but it was there.
Well, the impression I got from your book is that you learned early on to compartmentalize. Even though you were maybe unhappy at times, you still could do very well at school.
Yes, that was something I learned as a child, because my home life was, it was a bit dysfunctional, with my father being depressed and my mother having to take on responsibility for the family and resenting it. So indeed, I learned to compartmentalize. I would withdraw into my studies and my academic pursuits. And I was able to do that throughout my tumultuous adolescence and 20s.
There are parts of the book, Patricia, that describe very painful experiences in your young life, especially the period during which you were desperately trying to be straight. You were taken advantage of by an older man when you were an underage teenager. You had to go to Mexico for an abortion when you were only 19. It must have been incredibly difficult for you to write certain chapters of your book. Why did you want to put yourself through that?
Well, because it was part of my journey. It was part of what made me who I am, and I guess part of my resilience and strength. And also, I did write, one cringeworthy chapter, but I guess I felt it was important. The Me Too movement and all of that, and my conversations with other women of my generation or even younger made me feel that it was important to include that. And also, I had carried for years this shame that wasn't mine. And writing it and sort of putting it out there, I think, allowed me to let it go.
Was writing the book therapeutic for you?
Well, in part, because I think it allowed me to take control of the narrative of that part of my life and to understand the arc of transformation. So much transformation happened from late teens to age 30. And it just, at the time, of course, that it's happening, it's all going by in a blur. But looking back and recognizing the arc of these multiple transformations, to me was, I guess, enlightening and perhaps therapeutic. Yes.
Patricia, I want to read you something you wrote in the book about how you felt as a teenager. You said, tortured with feelings of not belonging, not having the right feelings for men, and having the wrong feelings for women, I didn't know what to do with my life. Patricia, if you could go back in time and give that scared young girl any advice, what would you say to her?
I think I would advise her to do exactly what I did, which is one of the reasons why I wrote the book. Is basically I had to I had to become myself, my authentic self. I had to. It wasn't a choice, a lifestyle choice. It was a matter of life, embracing the life to which I was born.
Well, I want you to know that a particular sentence you wrote in the book really resonated with me because I came out at 19, got thrown out by my parents, had a very rough time living on welfare, getting myself through law school. There were many times when I wondered if I did the right thing to come out when I did. But you wrote something that really hit home for me. You said, there are worse things than being rejected by your family and by society. Denying who you are is far worse. Patricia, that's such an important statement, and it's so very true. And you reinforced for me that I was right to come out when I did. So I want to thank you for that.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And I observed others who were continuing to deny who they were and the pain that caused. So I think at least, although life was not easy for either one of us, at least we were spared that pain of living a lie.
You had to deal with a lot of homophobia in your life. You were fired in 1984 for being a lesbian. Tell us about that.
Oh, yeah. I don't know. I was naive, I guess. I decided to take a job as a corporate director of medical services for a 50,000 employee company in the South. And I had been living in Boston and Washington, D.C., and I just thought my private life was my private life, and who cares, it's really nobody's business. And so I was blithely going about my job and my work in my usual gung-ho manner until, the corporate nurse came to me one day and said, the director of personnel knows that you live with a woman and that you're a lesbian, and he's going to fire your ass.
Wow.
And so I had a heads up. So I negotiated. I negotiated a settlement, but there was nothing preventing them from just firing me for being a lesbian.
Yeah, we all remember, those of us from our generation remember only too clearly what it was like to be that vulnerable. Now, in your application to medical school, you wrote this, I'm quoting you here. I would like to ease some of the arbitrary and unnecessary injustices people must bear, whether brought on by bodily malfunction or the social environment. Patricia, I think that's a fascinating statement to bring the concept of justice into the realm of health and medicine. What inspired that statement?
Well, I think in the late 60s and 70s, medicine was very much of a macho culture. The training was totally modeled after the army. And really, the compassion part of medicine, which my grandfather exhibited and which inspired me, just wasn't so much a part of medicine. And I guess I had some taste of that with my encounters, with my ill father. And I just wanted to do it differently. I wanted to bring some compassion to it, especially to the terminally ill. And, I thought justice was part of it, part of medicine, part of medical care.
Well, looking back at your medical career, do you feel that as a doctor, you achieved that early goal of addressing injustice?
I think so, because as you will discover, my career took a turn, and I ended up being an advocate for the health and safety of working people. And in fact, a lot of what I did was, toward improving the working conditions and health and safety of workers.
One of your female professors in university told you to soften your manner and
Yes.
not to be so aggressive and competitive, because she said it was very unbecoming for a woman and off-putting. It's really upsetting that a female educator would be so unsupportive to another woman. Did you encounter a lot of that in your career from other women?
Well, first of all, there weren't very many women. I had like two women role models in medical school. She was one of them. And she was a very severe looking, butch looking woman. And yeah, for her to tell me that I needed to soften my manner and not be so competitive and aggressive or people wouldn't like me just floored me. It was really, I got a lot more support from some of my male professors than I did from her or the one other woman.
Well,
And of
when
course,
you were the only female intern at your hospital in Boston, you faced a lack of support from some female nurses. You even wrote about a nurse who suggested that a male doctor be called when a patient needed attention. And you said that there was a time during the early stages of feminism when some women felt that female doctors couldn't be trusted because they were part of the male patriarchy of the medical profession. As a lesbian feminist doctor, what was your response to that attitude?
it was really, it was disappointing to me because I did experience some harassment from this one particular nurse that I described. And also, even when I went to work for the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, even there, I experienced discrimination because I was a physician and therefore part of the patriarchy. And I was told, I shouldn't counsel patients. Only, properly trained feminists should have those discussions. So,
It's just astounding.
yeah.
I see that you laugh about it now, but at the time, it's so shocking and it's so demoralizing. But I'm glad you can laugh about it now.
It was pretty upsetting at the time because it was hard to feel that I belonged anywhere, really.
I wish you and I had been friends back then. I would have been so supportive.
Well, I'm sure you would have. And as you know, I had a very dear male friend that was my colleague and ended up being my roommate. And, he was probably my most stalwart and constant supporter throughout the whole ordeal of medical school and training.
Oh, for sure. Now, it's clear from your book that your time as an intern in Boston was very unpleasant, to say the least. You described the working environment as hostile and dehumanizing, and you said that you were singled out and treated more harshly than the male interns. In fact, you were unfairly blamed for the death of a patient. How did you get through that period of your career?
Gosh, it was just a matter of survival. Really, it wasn't about learning, or it was just a matter of sheer survival. And I think that's true for many interns at that time, male or female. It was a brutal experience, which fortunately there have been many modifications of that now to become more humane. But yeah, how did I survive? I just, put my head down and ran. And, some of my fellow interns did not. I mean, one had a schizophrenic break. The other had a severe case of pneumonia and was hospitalized for weeks. And the rest of us had to pick up the slack.
You wrote this about what you were feeling as a young doctor, and I'm quoting you here. I had an aching sadness for the fragility of life, for the indignity of aging, for the inevitability of dying, and for the pain I inflicted with often useless treatments. You expressed dissatisfaction with the fact that the medical system spends the bulk of its resources on dying patients in the last few months of their lives with little positive impact. What's the solution to that dilemma?
Well, fortunately, nowadays there's palliative medicine, and the treatment of the terminally ill is far more humane now. Now there are many more options. But at that point in a teaching hospital, of course, the whole idea was to give the interns and residents opportunities to practice procedures and do everything possible for patients, even though it was hopeless and they were going to die anyway, sometimes as a result of our actions.
Do you think people understood that, the patients and their families?
I don't know. I did have one conversation with the patient, and she felt pressured by her son to allow these things to happen, but would have preferred to be just left alone, and said she wasn't afraid to die.
Wow. In your book, you referred to a book entitled The House of God by Samuel Shem, which is a classic satirical novel about the realities of medical internships in an American hospital. What did you think of that book?
Well, I read that, but it was written, he was an intern around the same time I was. And he had the same, or a similar brutal experience. And he wrote that at a hospital across town. And he wrote that book, he just captured things perfectly. I mean, it was sardonic, and there was a lot of gratuitous sex and all kinds of stuff in there that it probably could have done without, but it was great. I just read that book and I thought, man, he really nailed it.
Your book is quite revealing about your love life and your emotional development when you were a young woman. You wrote about your relationships with a number of women and your struggle to discover what you really wanted and needed in a partner. You made an interesting observation about lesbian relationships back in the late 70s. You said that monogamy was perceived by many lesbian feminists as part of the patriarchal system that was to be rejected and avoided because it was confining. That made it hard to sustain long-term relationships back then, didn't it?
It did. It really did, because authors, for example, Rita Mae Brown, who Ruby Fruit Jungle, that was like, everybody read that. Lesbians and she made the argument, as you described, that monogamy was part of the patriarchy. And so lesbian feminists, rejected that notion and felt that they should be free to follow the dictates of desire. And so for me, I did that, but I also really wanted to have a permanent, long-term monogamous relationship. And it was just really difficult at that time to find someone who felt the same.
Do you think that people's notions of monogamy and commitment have changed over the years in the gay community?
Well, certainly, I do. I mean, there's a whole spectrum, obviously. Some people, many people crave monogamy and have been partnered. Most of the people that I hang out with in Seattle have been in relationships for 40 years or more. So yes, I think that it certainly changed. Although there are others who, believe in polyamorous relationships. But, in one's youth, there's more exploration, of course. As we get older, we tend to want to settle down.
I want to read you something you wrote about relationships. You said, boundaries exist to protect tender feelings. Within the bounds of trust and loyalty, love can grow. When those boundaries are breached, trust fades and may never return, and along with it, the ability to engage fully in loving another. Patricia, that really sums up so beautifully what a healthy relationship should be all about. Have you finally achieved that in your life?
Yes, fortunately. It took a while, but indeed, I've been able to establish a relationship with a woman that's monogamous and deeply satisfying.
So what do you say to young people today who might be thinking, well, she wrote about the 60s and 70s. The world is very different today. Can you tell us why you believe the book is still very relevant today?
Yes, of course. I mean, it's as relevant today as ever, because we seem to be going backwards with regard to women's reproductive freedom, their ability to control their lives, and even personal freedoms such as birth control and the ability to love who and marry who you want is under attack, or will be potentially. So we're going backwards in this country. And I think many young people have no idea what it was like. and what it could be like again. I mean, there are some things that are different, but no, I think all the freedoms and the equality that we've taken for granted is fragile. And it looks like we're returning to that dark time again. So yes, I think it's very relevant today.
So do I, very, very much so. You wrote about some of your more memorable patients. There was a little boy who had burns on 80% of his body. There was an elderly man brought in from a nursing home who had no family at all, so you stayed with him so he wouldn't die alone. You witnessed so much human suffering and tragedy in your career. How did you deal with it emotionally?
You know, it was hard. I didn't have time to process these really, as you say, tragic events, and they would tend to run over and over in my mind, sometimes as I was working, and sometimes pop up and upset me with just little things in the future. It took me years really to process all that I witnessed in those years. And I was quite young too. I was only 24, 25. And, I was using all my mental energy just to survive.
Now, this is your very first book, and you've clearly demonstrated a real talent for writing. It's incredibly well written. I loved it. Do you have any plans to write another book?
Well, yes, I am writing a novel now. It's fiction, but it's so much easier to write fiction because, being with my background in research and science, it's like I felt for my memoir, I really need to make sure that I get every detail correct. And, was it really like this? And I checked my journal and everything. And it was, and also, some of the stuff that I had to write about brought up all these old feelings. So it was quite an emotional journey for me. But writing fiction is so much easier, at least for me.
Well, Patricia, I want to thank you so much for writing the book, which is not only an important part of LGBTQ history, but it's an important part of the evolution of the medical profession, and specifically the role of women in the profession. Thank you so much for taking the time to appear on our show.
Absolutely. I loved it, Harvey. Thank you.
Our guest has been Patricia Grayhall, author of Making the Rounds, Defying Norms in Love and Medicine, which is available on Amazon.com and every site where books are purchased. You can also get the book on patriciagrayhall.com. My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you to our producer, Steve Silver. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all the great interviews on the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when new videos are posted.